evening. Welcome to a very special event. My name is Carol DeBoer Langworthy, and I teach in the nonfiction writing program. And tonight we are having a works in progress with talkback from you. And the readers tonight are members of the nonfiction writing faculty. That's why you're here. I just want to remind you that there's this old saying that those who can't do teach, and I think tonight will show that those who teach can do when it comes to writing. So we are very happy to have this event. I ask you to please silence your cell phones, preferably even turn them off, and to be ready for our wonderful readings. Everybody will read first, and then you can ask questions. All right. So we're going to read in the order: Ed Hardy, and Rob Ward, Sue Rednick, and then Adam Gillespie. And you already know them, so I'm not going to go through their biographies. All right. So in the interest of time, take it away, Ed.
Well, thanks for coming out. Okay, so it's works in progress. Okay, so for me, it's sort of a dilemma because it's like I have this gigantic stove at my house, and there's like about 7 or 8 things on there, and some of them are way off to the side. And so what I'm going to do tonight, I'm going to read a bunch of 2 little short Fictionland monologue-y things. They're kind of way off on the side. Okay, so here's the backstory with this. This is a installation by a Swiss artist, Jan Rimon, and he does a lot of book art things and passages and things like that. And a couple of years ago, my friend Elizabeth Graber, who teaches at Boston College, she was editing the folio section of Post Road magazine, okay, and which is this little part in the middle here, with the gray pages. And so her idea was that she sent this image out to a whole bunch of writers, and they posted it and asked other people to send it, and everybody was supposed to write like a little piece that kind of went off this in some way or another. And I kept thinking, okay, sure, Ed, you should do this, okay? And then time went on and on and on and on. I got closer and closer to the deadline, and it was just about at the end of the deadline, and this is what came out. Okay, this is called Apology Number 21, or What You Should Know About the Library. Your surprise. Imagine my surprise when a mere 3 hours before dawn, I realized that this was entirely possible without adhesives. At first I feared that the paperbacks would be too slippery to be structural, and I was never sure that about the hardcovers or the amount of required friction. And yes, the glossy dust jackets were problematic, but the naked cloth-bound covers offered surprising stability, or as I suspected beneath the oh so many stars thanks to insomnia, perhaps it was the combined weight of the nouns and prepositions, never the verbs, the indexes, the endnotes, the page numbers, the contents, which compressed here have led to the new contents of this archway. I understand this is not what you asked for, especially in the shadow of the argument, which we both, I hope, and now realize was not about the library itself, but a result of the multidimensional stresses encountered here, given that you were handed this impossible situation by your late stepfather and his will, which required us to burn our remaining vacation days and fly on demand across the Atlantic to learn that the contents of the undisclosed room that you inherited and not the castle itself, which is going to your estranged brother, consisted of this collection of outdated technical volumes. In a language that neither of us can fluently speak and only one of us can barely read. But your oddly jolly stepfather, knowing how impossible it was and always has been and always will be for you to throw out any book, left this to you as a joke, an experiment in sly spite, and I watched fascinated as you serenely opened each of the library's arched second-floor windows and shouted, "These volumes have no earthly use, and I am defenestrating the library," while I stood by drinking your stepfather's Merlot and admiring your technique and knowing better than to intervene, as I listened to the whisper and the eventual thud of volume after volume spinning into the magenta sky before tumbling to the ancient and grassy courtyard. And after you went to bed in our chamber, which has no electricity, which has never had electricity, I sat in the suddenly drafty library drinking even more of your stepfather's Merlot until the giant candle guttered out, and creeping up on the conclusion that this was a sort of emergency, cul-de-sac of frustration and humiliation, which filled me with a sudden fear that this sadness could overspill and hunt us down at some point in the future, and that by finding an earthly use for these volumes and not boxing them up to be disposed of, I could reframe the entire question of usefulness. So I took action. I saw an opportunity, a way to wall off this surreal segment of our lives. And as dawn threatened and I ran low on hardcovers, I created the window. Because isn't every book both a window and a wall? In the hope that when your stepbrother arrives, this might reframe his view. And now, before you finish this page or your extremely strong coffee, it is time to call the taxi, to unfurl our return tickets and run off to Paris as we so meant to do in the first place. So that was the first one. Okay. And then the problem was, I sent it to them and they liked it. And they said, oh, that's great. And so they took it. And then, so that's where the trouble lies, because at that point I said, that wasn't that bad. That was okay. I could probably write a whole bunch of these, okay? And that's the line you really have to be careful about, because I could write a whole bunch of these. It goes on and on forever. So I did. Well, not a whole bunch. I wrote like a small bunch of these. So here's another one, okay? This is called Apology Number 7, about the Ottoman, or I Feel Bad About Plaid. After the taxi returns you from this latest emergency business trip to Dusseldorf, and you shoo the 15-pound cats off from the kitchen table, I pray that your gloved fingers will find these pages first. I will be in bed, employing my new sleep regimen in an attempt to avoid those pills, and no doubt dreaming of your exact expression when you finally do cross the living room's threshold. So by all means, do not fling this note aside in a mad rush to the living room. Though I have read that you are 3 times more likely to forget something when entering a new room, because your mind sees the threshold as an event boundary. And when crossing any event boundary, you file away the last experience to make way for the next. Thus, if reading this much has made the thought of running to that threshold to see if you will forget why you're going there too tempting, pay no attention to that voice in your head, because the Ottoman is not what you expect. Yes, I did text you to report an incident involving red wine, bacon fat, and the claws. And I know that the Ottoman came from your past life with spouse X, so it carries both emotional baggage and thrilling remembrances. But when I first glimpsed the wreckage of its faded to orange corduroy cover, and I thought, oh God, I'll just have to set this out and let the birds use it for nesting materials. However, imagining your action tipped me into one of my states, and I realized that I had on the wrong shirt. The wrong plaid shirt. I changed because a new shirt will often act as its own event boundary and create a psychic reboot. When exactly is she coming back from Dusseldorf? I wondered while buttoning up a red, blue, yellow, green, black Royal Stewart. 6 whole days. Why, yes, I scooped up the Ottoman and carried it to the car, silently repeating the word Ottoman until it felt like I was hauling along an entire empire. And I drove it right to Walter the upholsterer. Walter squinted darkly, mumbled a price, and said Saturday. And you know that I'm a man who could never handle swatches. This morning, Walter called, all done, and since I was already off to buy another 64-pound bag of cat food, I stopped at Walter's first. I found the Ottoman enshrouded in the cloudy protective plastic, and because it waited in the gleaming penumbra of Walter's candy red Harley-Davidson, I never noticed. It was only after I returned to the living room and allowed the demon cats to shred the plastic that I began to recognize the faint outline of a mistake. Soon enough, a naked burst of late morning sun burst through the front windows, and I saw that the Ottoman was in fact a brilliant tower of plaid, a blue, red, green, blue, white beacon in a dense hardwood sea. It wasn't that I missed the old Ottoman exactly, but I was afraid that you would, which led to a fresh moment of tension, so I changed my shirt. And then I opened my half of the closet and I felt the chill of epiphany. Plaid, plaid, plaid. They hung there so quietly, so vertically, but they were all plaid. Within the universe of plaid there is near infinite variety. The subtle dress Campbell, the boisterous McAllister, that turquoise one which somebody just invented. And while I know it has never occurred to you, the completeness of this array while I know it has occurred to you, the completeness of this array had never occurred to me. But there you were, aboard a Lufthansa Airbus 320, high over wrecked Iceland and heading home at 600 miles an hour. How had I slipped from a mild early 90s preference based on my dead grandfather's shirts to such uniformity? Why do we love what we love? I sat on the bed where the air seemed thicker. And I'm not even Scottish. I am some Northern European / British Isles amalgam. I have rented Braveheart more than once, and who doesn't enjoy a little blue face paint? Eventually, I sensed that the infinite array of choice within the world of plaid is not the same as the choice to leave the world of plaid. And in a twitchy burst, I dehangered and vowed to donate a full third of my shirts. Only as I dragged my trash bag of doomed tartan across the threshold, I sensed that we might be at cross purposes regarding plaid, and therefore the recovered ottoman. I began to understand that you might see plaid not as a multiplicity, but a kind of visual chaos that should only be employed sparingly, like strong seasoning. Which reminds me of last night's dream, the one where I had to run errands on an undulating green, white, maroon field of plaid, only whenever I stopped to take a deep breath, the lines of color beneath my feet would rotate from a 90-degree intersection to 180-degree parallel stripes. And I like stripes. This is progress. We might, it seems, someday even reorder our worlds in parallel. So, think of what you're about to see, not as an intensely plaid ottoman, but a beacon on the sea of future harmony. Oh, and the ceiling fixture burst out after the cat's sewn on it, and I had to rearrange the furniture so it don't trip. So that's it. So there are a couple more, but the thing I sort of realized as I was going along is that, like, at first this seemed like this great idea that I could just kind of like hop into it and like be this guy and like crank out a few more apologies and everything. And then I sort of realized that as it went along, once it gets bigger and bigger, it takes on basically all the same problems you have with a novel, right? Because you have to figure out, it's got to have a through line, it's got to have an arc, you got to figure out who these people are and why they're having all these problems. And so at that point, I kind of realized to actually do this, I have to sort of be in this bubble of this guy like for a long period of time. So that's how it kind of ended up sort of like on a side burner right now. So it's still there, but it's just sort of a slow burner. So we're taking questions at the end, I guess. Okay. All right. Thanks.
I love that. I just wrote it down because I want to remember it, where Ed said, "Isn't every book a window in a wall?" Which I thought was so beautiful.
Somebody else might have said that.
So beautiful. Yeah. I wanted to start my talk with a couple of apologies. One is that this is very rough work in progress, and I just wanted to remind you of that. The other thing is that to my students as well, I'll never ever say to you again, don't leave a talk till the last minute, because the pressure actually worked very well to get me putting words down on the paper. I've been reading on the topic for quite a while. It's actually the pressure of coming today has helped me complete a very, very rough draft of the piece. So I'm going to jump straight into the talk. So this work in progress is born out of a memory of risk and survival. It's about the act of revising our writing. I'm interested in understanding the revision practice I developed for myself as an undergraduate many, many years ago, quite a long time ago actually. I believe we all have stories that are about or we bring to our revision practices. So in this essay, ultimately, a bit further down the line when I'm looking for it to be published, I want to connect with and appreciate those individual human stories, which I think are often missed in research on the subject. And my intention is to eventually submit this essay to a journal like College English, mainly because that's where the research on the subject has been published over the last, say, 30 years or so. My working title at the moment is Revision, an Act of Survival. I thought the kind of title was catchy, and I actually took the title from Adrian Rich's article, When We Dead Awaken, Writing as Revision. And in that piece, and it's a really fascinating piece if you ever get a chance to read it, it's not too long, she talks about the role of revision, what she calls the act of looking back, of seeing with fresh eyes. And she talks about it specifically in our reading and writing of women's experiences and their struggle for equality in American society. And I love this. I love reading this particular essay. I love that Rich gives revision a social and personal and specifically a gendered aspect. And as I read this essay, I couldn't help think of other possible stories too, that may need a social and personal context to fully appreciate them. Stories from individuals who so desperately want to be published memoirists or poets or journalists. Stories from students who are working to address the intellectual and time pressures of university life. Stories from students brought up in disadvantaged communities who are often the first in their families to attend universities. We know that revision often means the survival of our texts being written. But is it also a matter of survival for the individual writer too? The playwright Arthur Miller said that he knew he had to write about a subject, his subject, Willie Loman, in Death of a Salesman, when he moved into his head and started unpacking his things, which I love that kind of analogy. This character moves into a playwright's head and just opens a suitcase and unpacks his trousers and things like that. And similarly, revision has been playing on my mind for quite a while. And after all, it's something that everybody in this room does. And what I want to do now is go back briefly to a time in the 1980s. The setting is the South Wales Valleys, where I grew up. And it's an industrial region historically built on coal, iron, steel. But the end of that decade, by the end of the 1980s, and after a long and bloody miners' strike that ended in defeat for the miners, basically everybody I knew was either working in the mines or working in the steelworks. Most of the collieries and steelworks had gone, and they replaced that at the time Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister. She replaced it with high unemployment, a drug problem, low-skilled, low-paid factory culture. And that's where I, and actually everybody I knew in the valleys, ended up. We all ended up in this culture. And there are millions of these stories across the globe, of course, and they're captured so well by people like Studs Terkel or Mike Rose, who's one of my favourites. In an article, Adrienne Rich does afterwards capture a feeling of living in such a world. She says, "What frightened me most was the sense of drift, of being pulled along on a current that called itself my destiny." The people of the Welsh Valleys rarely heard talk of anybody going to university, and if we did, those people were often spoke about with a kind of reverence that made higher education seem completely unobtainable. But as the 80s wore on and became the 90s, I think there was a different atmosphere, and many like myself did eventually go to university. I went to the University of Wales. Taken advantage of the educational grants that were then offered in Britain, they're now loans. And university, as it should be, was an eye-opening and beautiful world, a world of books and conversation. And it's where many revision stories, including mine, begin. And what I experienced then, and what I've learned over the years from listening to students from similar lower class backgrounds, was a fear. And that fear was simmering and tangible, but also quite unnameable, of being found out perhaps, a fear of not being perhaps intellectually astute enough to be part of this other kingdom that they found, a fear of being sent packing, sent back. And I became increasingly aware of that fear after the return of my first essay, which I think was on, if I recall it right, it was on the deaf South African poet, David Wright. The professor's comments, I've long since forgotten them, but I still remember the D- he gave me. It's still very ever present to me. And in fact, for much of that semester, that's all I got. Sometimes I would get what's called the occasional gentleman's C- that was given to me by kind-hearted souls. And to rescue myself from drowning, I knew I had to work differently. What was interesting in British universities at the time is that there wasn't any kind of writing class, like the academic essay or the research essay. And if you go to a professor and ask about writing, they weren't that interested in talking about it. They would talk about the ideas, but how to construct a sentence or put a paragraph together, they weren't that interested. So what happened next was wasn't really the development of a theory or practice for myself. It was more a habit that I stumbled into that I am now interested in sort of theorising or thinking about. So my old habit of writing one draft, and that draft was kind of bubbling over with generalisations and bumbling, disconnected prose, gave way to a process that saw multiple drafts. And after a while, and I can't tell you exactly how long it took, but after a while the results seemed miraculous, not only in terms of grades, my grades shot up, but in terms of more important things, like the clarity of thought, a direction it gave me, and a conversational, maturing, and informed human presence on the page, which I think now, in my kind of elder years, I think is probably the most important thing. This process then of revision began with reading and taking notes, which has always for me been one of the most enjoyable experiences. And during those rituals of everyday life, you know, the walk into the supermarket to get groceries, the walk into and from home, I would have thoughts about that topic that I would quickly write down on scraps of paper and push these deeper into my pockets. And as time went on, I accumulated quite a lot of these scraps. So by the time I came to write a rough draft, I'd already spent considerable time thinking and writing and kind of mentally revising. I wrote a rough draft, I think, in about an hour or two, using a technique I now know is called free writing, devised by Peter Elbow, which is basically to get everything down onto paper. Actually, an Elbow also had the same experience of accumulating scraps. So much of this draft was an irrelevant mess. In fact, probably most of it was, but not entirely so. And what was really interesting for me now looking back is I must have trusted the direction in that piece of writing, because I would often skip any attempt at a detailed physical outline, preferring to read aloud the mess, followed by a recopying in handwriting of relevant material, adding a greater level of clarity and focus and structure as I went through different drafts. In Shakespeare's King Lear, Lear wonders how the newly blind Gloucester sees the world, to which Gloucester replies, "I see it feelingly." I realise now that copying by hand enabled me to feel my way through the draft, getting a better sense of where to place paragraphs so the essay flowed better, or where to put a certain claim that would make it stand out more, and so on. And in between each successive draft, I would read, say, just one journal article or book chapter, something quite manageable that would enable me to enrich aspects of my work by responding to different ideas. And then would come the final draft, and it would take a while to get there. And I'd always had this kind of ritual that I developed. I would write with a hard-tipped orange Bic pen, and I would write on thin-lined paper. I don't know why, but that's what I did. And before picking up this pen, I would read just a few pages, maybe one or two, from writers that I was then starting to admire for the grace and clarity of their prose. Writers like Tony Tanner and Raymond Williams and Harold Bloom and the Welsh historian Dai Smith. And I still ask myself these questions, but I know I asked myself the questions then, how did they write so well? And how can I even come near to crafting prose like that? Even today, I tell my students, say in the academic essay or other courses I teach, to find a role model in writing, a writer that might influence them without taking away their own unique though not static, human voice. And I feel doing that gives us a sense of the writers we want to become. So, for me, revision, for it to work, has to be a transformative experience. And my writing was definitely changing during that time, but I was changing along with it. In their 1961 essay, A Freshman Heresy, David Cole and Lawrence Ruff dismissed the practice of copying as leading the student nowhere. By making our students copy old work, they might say, we turn our classrooms into scriveners' offices, populated by ginger nuts and Bartleys. So this may be true for some students, but not for others. And I'm cautious about casting blanket theories over a large number of developing writers. My purpose in writing this essay is not to challenge such remarks, which I feel have shaped the views of three of the most notable scholars on revision over the years, namely Nancy Summers, Linda Flower, and Ron Sedol. Rather, my purpose is to understand the peculiarities of my revision story and eventually to connect it with the revision stories of others. Besides, I wonder whether revision also depends on the attitude of the student approaching their drafts, their willingness not only to re-see it, which of course is part of the word's etymology from the late 16th century, but to hear it and feel it too, and then to commit to the hard slog that is required to produce numerous and developing drafts. Copying brought me closer to these drafts. It enabled me to hear and refine the dissonance within them, and feel the cadence of words and transitions and ideas come out into my hand as it should as an act of my labour. I love these kind of epiphanies, Christine Ogden remarks in an interview with Mike Rose, when we discover some way of writing that will change everything for us. I now wonder what would have happened if, as a freshman undergraduate, I had shared my revision story, which doesn't start with writing, but with the resolve to change our lives. I'm sure I would have met others keen to share their stories, thereby creating a supportive community of shared interests and enthusiasms. What would happen if we tapped into those stories and somehow, and that word, I realise how vague that word is, but it is a rough draft after all, but somehow enabled each student to actually see their work and themselves as the writers of that work. We might ask not when or how you revise, but why. And that why might invite a response story that goes back way before the student starts tapping words onto the keyboard. We might also go so far as to consider the established advice on revision. That is, to put your drafts away for a while, so when you return to them, you look at them as a stranger. That advice, so championed by revision scholars like Lester Fakeley and Donald Murray, has helped many writers, might help many of you in this room. But how helpful is it for somebody who is already a complete stranger to any kind of writing, or even seeing themselves as a student in the first place? So I'd like to suggest that copying with specific additional requirements, and another vague word I know, may, as a first step in the process, help some students from diverse backgrounds build that intimate connection with their work, enabling them to achieve eventually what Joseph Harris calls a consciousness of their own writing. But I also feel that this ought to be infused with what Adrian Rich sees as an appreciation of their personal survivalist consciousness. Thanks for listening.
Can you guys see me? This is... Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, like Ed, I I was doing some fiction writing. I have 75% of a novel done, and I sent some of it to my agent, and she said, "Why do all you nonfiction writers think you have to write a novel?" That was her way of saying, just stop, don't do this. So, this essay that I'm going to read to you has some of the same themes as that stupid long novel draft, and it's only 8 pages long. I have sent this to the New York Times Modern Love editors, and I'm getting very frustrated that I have not gotten my rejection back yet, because usually they reject fast. But I'm hoping that you'll, besides listening to the story, give me some tips on what I can change, add, clarify, because I'm going to send it out to other places as soon as I get that stupid rejection. So, I'm calling it Calling from Crazyland. The call came 33 years after I'd stopped hoping for it. "Hey, it's Jeff," he said. "Can you file a Freedom of Information request for my FBI files?" No last name, no context. He acted as though we'd had frequent phone conversations instead of 2 fleeting ones in the past 3 decades. Coming from a different old friend, this request may not have seemed strange. I'm a journalist, so presumably I have experience getting classified information. Someone legitimately concerned that the FBI was tracking him might be wise to ask a third party to gather the documents. Neither of these was the case. Instead, Jeff had misplaced the mind he'd already lost and found at least twice before. He has a serious mental illness, though I don't know exactly which one. Schizoaffective, bipolar 2, because I don't really know him. He was a kid I made out with a few times, a guy who bought me coffee in an airport once when I traveled through his city. He also may have changed the course of my life. When he called, we certainly weren't close enough for me to ask which diagnosis his doctors had settled on. But whatever it is, his disease causes paranoia and psychosis, and had transformed him in midlife from a prosperous businessman, father, and husband to a homeless person with a criminal record. Psychiatric meds quashed his demons whenever he agreed to take them, but like so many others, he tossed the pills when he felt well, claiming he couldn't bear the side effects. I'd recently noticed from nonsensical religious postings on Facebook that he didn't seem well. Still, I was miffed that he'd reached out to me. "Where are you?" I asked. He was calling from a field, he told me in a cheery, energetic voice, because the apartment he was about to be evicted from had no electricity. His phone was disposable, though I never ascertained whether that was because he couldn't afford a mobile plan or whether it was a ploy to throw off the phone-tapping feds. I played along with his request, telling him to send me the details of his case so I could look into it. I was lying, but it seemed preferable to turning him away. I thought my fiction might bring him some comfort, the feeling that someone was in his corner. I owed him that much. We'd met as teenagers when I went to a National Student Council convention, a setting that tells you a lot about my nerd-to-cool ratio at the time. 2 other girls and I were assigned to live with his family for the week. His mother led us to our quarters in their finished basement, a posh, wet bar-equipped setup where Jeff and his friends were playing pool. The first thing he did was offer me a Coors. I'd had alcohol before, but not during the day, and certainly not in someone's house when his mom was around. But my East Coast traveling companions and I had vowed to sample Coors, then only available in his home state, so I took the can. That he offered me this delicacy with no regard for the conventional rules of underage partying with strange house guests illustrates his nerd-to-cool ratio at the time. As the week progressed, I spent the days strategizing about school spirit and the nights falling for him. Given that I'd been boy crazy since kindergarten, my being drawn to a blonde, blue-eyed, albeit slightly chubby specimen wasn't so strange. The fact that he fell back for me was. Until that week, none of my crushes had ever been reciprocated. Sure, boys had liked me, asked me to dances, even sent me love notes. but not the right boys, not the ones I craved. This time the attraction was mutual. For 5 months, as soon as the convention bus dropped me back at his house, I ran downstairs, brushed my teeth, and met him outside. In my memory, we sit under big stars in a big sky, either on a swing set or in a gazebo. The details are fuzzy, the feelings are not. That boy was bringing me to life, and not just because he was the first one to put his hands under my shirt. Maybe we'd been enchanted by each other's differences. He may have seen me as an Eastern sophisticate while I imagined him with his actual swagger and cavalier attitude to be a modern-day cowboy. Both assessments turned out to be bad cases of projection. But the whys of our attraction aren't relevant. All that mattered was that someone had noticed me and moved closer instead of stepping away. Of course it didn't last. We saw each other 2 more times over the next few years while I visited one of the girls who'd also stayed at his house and lived near his college. We exchanged some letters, though he was so reluctant to write that I once sent him a form letter that he could mail back to me. I was not sure if we had ever spoken on the phone. In the end, he blew me off the way everyone did in those pre-digital days, by seeming to drop off the earth. Soon after he stopped responding to my letters, I heard from our mutual friend that he'd logged his first DUI arrest, an event that helped me move on fast. I didn't suspect then that his heavy drinking was possibly his way of self-medicating a budding mental illness, but I started to realize that maybe he wasn't as dreamy as I'd imagined. He partied to excess, was irresponsible, and lived like a shallow frat boy. Plus, he'd blown me off, which meant the door was officially closed, at least from my side. Because now, you see, I had self-esteem. It would take me years to trace my evolution from desperate wallflower to I'm not going to take that shit kind of girl back to him. But the fact is, when I returned from the student council trip, I was different. Someone who seemed way cooler than all the boys at my school had chosen me. Hence, I couldn't be so bad. That change in attitude straightened my spine, shrunk my neediness. I stopped pining over crushes who didn't like me back, which probably explains why I began to attract quality boys and develop real relationships, each one leading to my current 24-year-strong marriage, all because of someone I barely knew. Some people have teachers or coaches who change their lives. I had a boy with a ticking bomb in his brain. I essentially forgot all about him for decades. Then one night, when the staid suburban blues made me nostalgic for my past and yearning for a visit with my old self, I decided to look him up online. LinkedIn provided the image of a successful entrepreneur, which wasn't a surprise. I sent a message asking if he remembered me. Of course he wrote back, then sent his email address so we could catch up. I expected to hear about a thriving family, wealth, business triumphs, the grown frat boy version of success. I would wish him well and move on. Instead, I got the outlines of a breakdown. He said he didn't remember most of it, and what he did recall seemed real, like actual memories of the Pope visiting him in jail rather than hallucinations. He knew he had to stay away from religion, his downfall, but that work at a call center was getting him back to the business world, and that he liked a woman in his support group. After sharing updates on our marriages and children during my layover in his city, we got on with our lives, our communication dwindling to Facebook birthday wishes, except when he got sick. For some reason, he called me when he was at his worst. The first time we'd spoken, he had also been mid-breakdown. I tried to cajole him into getting back on his meds. The result, predictably, involved angry pushback. I stopped corresponding with him. A year or so later, he apologized online and I accepted. "It's okay," I wrote, "you were sick." And now he was sick again. He texted me a few weeks after asking me to find his FBI files. "Did you ever have time to do the background check?" he typed. Again, I didn't know who he was at first. Again, I strung him along. "I need to figure out how to do it, so be patient. It might take a while," I wrote. He signed off by providing his exact longitude and latitude. I'd become electronic friends with his sister, so I told her that he was reaching out for my help from imaginary persecutors. There wasn't much more I could do. My husband and others advised me to cut communication with him again, which I did, but not without reservations. I couldn't stop wondering, what do we owe the people who awakened us? Breathing life into someone by recognizing her value is no small thing. Not only did Jeff accomplish that when we met, but by pushing me away a few years later, he probably boosted my quality of life a second time. If he hadn't let go with such certainty, would I have continued to hang on? If so, would I have become his first ex-wife? Would my grown children be trying to mop him up now? The last I heard, he graduated from jail to a psychiatric hospital. I hope he stays well this time and stops seeing medication as the enemy. If he doesn't, he could end up like so many other mentally ill adults, asleep on a bench, judged by passers-by as useless. They may view him as someone who didn't try hard enough, or as a lost cause to be pitied. They will not see the pretty blue eyes or the self-assured smile, and they certainly won't realize that the man before them, who may look to have wasted his life, was a blessing in mine.
See if the table can support a cup of water. Hello. I'm going to read excerpts from an essay in progress. First, a little introduction. Somehow my father convinced my mother to squander a date night and watch David Lynch's Dune when it was first in the theaters in 1984. I was 7, my sister was 5. When we asked about the movie, my mother or my father or both, they may have coordinated their anecdote, told me they knew they were in trouble when the theater manager handed out to everyone in the audience a one-sheet that attempted to explain the intricacies of the film's logic. Tonight, I am the theater manager, and what's worse, the production I need to untangle is my own. So, in 1977, George Lucas released Star Wars. In 1980, he released a sequel, The Empire Strikes Back. And in 1983, another sequel called Return of the Jedi. During Jedi's production, and even after its release, Jedi was often referred to as Star Wars 3. This is not to be confused with Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, a Star Wars prequel released in 2005. Also, until the end of 1982, Return of the Jedi was titled Revenge of the Jedi. And this is not to be confused with Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. And I read about two directors named David. David Lynch, who wrote and directed Blue Velvet and co-created and directed Twin Peaks, and David Cronenberg, who wrote and directed Videodrome and the 1986 remake of The Fly. I don't mean for this to be confusing. And I will read from an excerpt of the screenplay for David Lynch's Revenge of the Jedi. You'll recognize it's the screenplay excerpt when I read Interior, Death Star, Main Docking Bay. Okay, let's begin. On David Lynch's Revenge of the Jedi, George Lucas and producer Howard Kazanjian considered a number of directors for the third Star Wars film. By April 1981, the decision was between two directors. Lucas offered the job to David Lynch. According to Kazanjian, Lynch was thrilled at that point, and since May 1980, the film was called Revenge of the Jedi. Among the best known on Lucas and Kazanjian's list of might-be directors for the new Star Wars film were Richard Donner, John Carpenter, Terry Gilliam, David Cronenberg, Richard Lester, and John Boorman. This list provides us with a set of what-ifs, some not as compelling as others. Donner, for instance, had, by 1981, directed The Omen, Superman, Inside Moves, and half, give or take, of Superman 2. The Superman films make him an obvious choice. He worked within a well-established mythology, with significant FX, and incidentally with composer John Williams. Furthermore, Donner's films are without a notable style, a plus if Lucas wanted the trilogy to look of a piece. As out of place as the other directors on Kazanjian and Lucas's list might seem, when their cinematic careers are considered only to 1981, their inclusion is easier to understand. For instance, by 81, Terry Gilliam had directed only one film, the fantasy comedy Jabberwocky. And David Cronenberg, while more established, was at that point best known for a single image, the exploding head of the first scanner in the film Scanners, an effect, by the way, built for Cronenberg by Chris Wallace, a creature consultant on Jedi. Lucas chose Lynch to direct Jedi shortly after The Elephant Man. Lynch's second feature film proved to be a success. But Lucas was already familiar with and liked Lynch's work. Lucas, overseeing second unit work at Elstree Studios in London for The Empire Strikes Back, crossed paths with director Stanley Kubrick, who was filming The Shining. Lucas had just seen David Lynch's Eraserhead and praised it for its timeless style. You couldn't tell what decade it was shot in, he told Kubrick admiringly. For what it's worth, Kubrick liked Eraserhead too. According to David Hughes' The Complete Lynch, Kubrick screened Eraserhead for the cast and crew of The Shining in order to put them in the mood for the film he was making. Lynch tells a related anecdote in his book, Catching the Big Fish. Some guys who were working with George Lucas said, "Yesterday, David, we were out at Elstree Studios and we met Kubrick. And as we were talking to him, he said to us, 'How would you fellas like to come up to my house tonight and see my favorite film?' They said, 'That would be fantastic.' They went up and Stanley Kubrick showed them Eraserhead. So right then I could have passed away peaceful and happy." By the way, and I realize we're in the midst of a for what it's worth, while there is no reason to doubt this anecdote, I do doubt that Kubrick said "fellas," etc. The whole dialogue clearly put through a Lynch filter. David Lynch declined the offer to direct Revenge of the Jedi. There are several explanations for why Lynch turned down Lucas's offer. Kazanjian suggested simply that Lynch turned down the offer because Dino De Laurentiis offered him Dune, an offer Lynch accepted. More recently, Kazanjian said, at a Star Wars celebration convention in Anaheim, that Lynch wasn't hired because, he didn't want Johnny Williams to do the music, and he didn't want Ben Burtt, Academy Award winner like 3 times, to do the sound. He added, "That's the truth, and only you guys have heard it." The audience applauds, and the moderator adds, "Ha ha ha, wow, that's incredible." Incredible, yes, as in hard to believe. Kazanjian's original claim that Lynch weighed the pros and cons of Lucas's offer and chose Dune instead is more credible. My favorite explanation is David Lynch's, told in response to the question, why do you turn down George Lucas for directing Star Wars Return of the Jedi? To preserve the character of the anecdote, oft repeated I suspect, I've kept Lynch's ahs and stutters, etc. I was asked by George to come up to see him and talk to him about directing what would be the third Star Wars. And I had next door to zero interest, but I always admired George. You know, George is a guy that does what he loves, and I do what I love. The difference is what George loves makes hundreds of billions of dollars. So I thought I should go up and at least visit with him, and it was incredible. I had to go to this building in LA first and get a special credit card, and I had to get special keys, and a letter came and a map, and they had a rental car all ready for me, and these keys, and everything was set. And I was to drive to this place, and I came to an office, and there was George, and he talked with me for a little bit, and then he said, "I want to show you something." And right about at this time, I started to get a little bit of a headache. So he took me upstairs, and he showed me these things called Wookiees. And now this headache is getting stronger. And he showed me many animals and different things. Then he took me for a ride in his Ferrari for a lunch. And George is kind of short, so his seat was way back, and he was almost laying down in the car, and we were flying through this little town up in Northern California. We went to a restaurant, and not that I don't like salad, but that's all they had was salad. And then I got really almost like a migraine headache, and I could hardly wait to go home. But before I got home, I kind of crawled into a phone booth and called my agent and said there was no way I could do this. He said, David, calm down, you don't have to do this. And so George, bless his heart, I told him on the phone the next day that he should direct it. It's his film. He'd invented everything about it. But he doesn't really love directing. And so someone else did direct that film. But I called my lawyer and told him I wasn't going to do it, and he said, "You just lost. I don't know how many millions of dollars, but it's okay." There's no audience reaction included at the end of this clip, but Lynch's anecdote is meant to amuse, and it is amusing, so I assume the reaction was laughter. That Lynch was offered Jedi is generally met with amusement. For instance, Dan Fitch wrote, "The very notion is as surreal as one of David Lynch's own films. Could the director of such unorthodox fare as Eraserhead, Blue Velvet, and Lost Highway really have taken charge on Return of the Jedi?" There is nothing surreal about a film producer generating a list of available directors, and that list getting narrowed down to one or two. Fitch goes on to speculate. As for what would have been the consequence of a Lynch-directed Return of the Jedi, why, YouTube is awash with Star Wars fans' interpretations. Those backward-talking emperors have to be seen to be believed. Fitch exaggerates. There are 3 such interpretations, the best by Samuel C. Spitale. As parodies, these interpretations are amusing, but in no way do they imagine a Lynch-directed Jedi, because it ignores where Lynch was artistically in 1980, and that Return of the Jedi could only ever be George Lucas's Return of the Jedi. Even a Lucas Jedi could only be another Star Wars based on and in response to the template established by the first Star Wars. The only original vision is A New Hope. Greg Olson suggests that Lynch made the sound judgment that he didn't want to be a journeyman worker within a minutely detailed imaginative universe of established characters and situations that another artist had dreamed up. Jedi could never be Lynch's Jedi, except subtly. Interior, Death Star, main docking bay, close-up. The face of Darth Vader, mask of volcanic glass, brilliantly lit landing bay and white armored legions therein reflected, a star field. Wipe tube, exterior, road to Jabba the Hutt's palace, Tatooine. as the image of Darth Vader's face is erased, our eyes naturally look to the image that replaces Vader's face, a desert road. But for a moment, the Vader star field and the road share the screen. Even as Vader's face is replaced by sand, there is an after image, an ocular trick only, that lingers. The sharp angles of Vader's face, the dark lenses where would be eyes, that breath, a machine, a desert wind, it crackles hate. In this after image, all the seams of Vader's mask are apparent, and the gruesome flesh within seeks to ooze from them. We float above the desert road. Ripples of dust undulate tide-like in the light of the moon. The whispering grains billow up like the foam of waves as they hit the rock. Sand blows past and toward the horizon. A wind, barely audible, but felt large, sounds along the road, caught between walls of rock, a road cut millions of years before by torrents of water, all gone deep underground. Cut to interior, dark water, a mental image. Suddenly, a drop falls into the black, and white-hot, widening rings appear on the dark water's surface. Darkness again. Cut to exterior, road to Jabba the Hutt's palace, Tatooine. Only the desperate and the foolhardy use this road. We hear a familiar beeping and a distinctive voice before we catch sight of R2-D2 and C-3PO as they make their way along the road toward the ominous palace. George Lucas and producer Howard Kazanjian considered a number of directors for the third Star Wars film. By April 1981, the decision was between two directors, David Lynch and Richard Marquand. When Lynch declined, Marquand was offered the job and accepted. Richard Marquand directed Return of the Jedi. Michael Cheyenne speculates as to why Lucas offered Jedi to Lynch at all. In 1981, Lucas proposed that Lynch direct the third episode of the first Star Wars trilogy, Return of the Jedi. This was a sign of esteem and confidence in view of the financial as well as the emotional stakes riding on this third episode, which would have to match the global success of the first two. Lucas's choice may seem surprising because in Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back, the emphasis had been on the brio with which scenes were linked to each other and on the lightheartedness of the overall tone. Lucas's proposition suggests that along with the obligatory purple passages, he wished to give the third episode a graver tone in line with the mellowing of characters and the trials they had undergone. I wonder, though, if Lucas was looking to make a darker entry, Lynch makes sense. But why, then, consider Marquand? Maybe Lucas entertained simultaneously radically different visions for his film, a dark Star Wars and a bright Star Wars. Jabba's pleasure barge or the forest moon of Endor. Or perhaps Lucas knew Lynch would never direct a Star Wars. Lucas just enjoyed the frisson of offering the film to Lynch, but deliberately set out to scare Lynch with Wookiees. Thank you.
Thank you all. I think this demonstrates the kind of variety that we have in our program. For the questions now, I suggest that you can just fire away, and in this setting, you can call the writers by their first name, Ed, Sue, Adam, and Ron. Okay? None of this professor stuff. All right? So, let fly.
Adam, is that a work of fiction or nonfiction?
It's a work of nonfiction that attempts to make an argument with some creative writing. Is that slippery enough as an answer?
Were the quotes real quotes?
Yes, quotes are real quotes. Yeah, absolutely. The only part that is not real is David Lynch's screenplay to Revenge of the Jedi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go on for the question. Yes.
Why did you pick apology for your series in progress?
I don't know.
I knew you were going to say this way, yes.
I don't know. Because this character kind of popped into my head, and he was like apologizing for doing this whole thing, and then I just thought, I don't know. It just sort of, I was kind of like mining from that first one, and it just sort of seemed like, well, maybe you just go on apologizing for all kinds of stuff over and over and over. So kind of because it's kind of a weird form. So yeah, I think that was sort of it.
Was the first one, how many sentences were in the first one?
3.
Just 3?
Yeah, the first one's just 3. It's like one big block.
Yeah.
And they said, don't you want paragraphs? I said, yeah.
So just 3 sentences?
Yeah, and then the other ones were like,
Regular?
yeah, more regular stuff. I don't quite know where it's going to go if I keep going. They could be more blocks, but then it sort of felt like a little restricted.
Yeah.
I have a question for Robert,
Okay.
Professor Ward. So I love the personal anecdote about revision, and I'm curious about how you're going to dig up, or if you've already found a source of other similar anecdotes from these authors that you admire, or if you're going to do interviews, or if you've thought about that.
Not from the authors I admire, because I've never traced their personal backgrounds. But over the years of being a teacher, I just heard people say, students say, this means everything to me. If I don't get this right, what's going to happen? And they've kind of built up in my kind of imagination. And I've always connected with them on a personal level because I've experienced that myself. So my kind of ambition, I think, is to kind of collect some of those in writing, some from memory maybe, but that's kind of unreliable. But maybe some, as I'm teaching at Brown, I'm going to collect them. I meet a lot of students in conferences and we talk about these kind of things. So, so not from the published writers I can admire, but from individual students' stories.
Cool.
I'm sure you're not this shy in class, so.
Susan. This was the nonfiction version of what you're doing in the fiction.
Yeah.
So, what's the difference?
Well,
I mean, other than the fact obviously you don't have to stick with facts.
right. Well, in the fictionalized version, there's lots of scenes and lots of character development and lots of, there was a whole plot like running around the country to save this guy and
So in
crap
the,
like that.
in the novel, is it narrated first person the way your nonfiction?
No, I actually had 3 different characters narrating.
And so what is it you're still trying to figure out? Because you want us to answer some kind of question.
Oh, well, where else should I submit it and what's confusing? The basic things that we do for the students. What's wrong, missing? Feel free to email me. Constructive criticism.
This is your chance, guys. How often do you get to give it back?
Right.
It's an interesting frankly.
What part are you most worried about?
maybe it was too repetitive in some areas.
Like talking about how crazy he was.
I don't know, that wasn't repetitive enough. I don't know, just some of the theme of being noticed, I'm not sure. While I was reading that, I was thinking, didn't I just say this?
Did anybody else, like, who read, learn more about their piece by just by reading it out loud? Like, I feel like I'm always telling people, you know, try reading your stuff out loud, see what happens, see what you can hear. Did that actually, like, that sounds like that kind of happened for you.
Oh,
Did that
yeah.
happen for any of the other three? Where you're like, ooh,
Well, I didn't have an oh moment tonight at the actual reading, but this reading is very much a construction for tonight. I have a much more unwieldy essay that has lots of references, and I couldn't figure out a way to read it unless I reconstructed it. And in the process of doing that, I think I actually improved parts of it, realized that there were things that were redundant. And so, in a way, what Robert's talking about, the pressure cooker of knowing that you're going to talk to helps. But I strongly advocate reading rough work in front of an audience. It's very enlightening. Definitely.
There was a question in the back row. Yes.
Oh, you said that your book is told from 3 perspectives. Is one of them told from the perspective of the man you wrote about?
Yes.
If so, how is writing the voice of someone with a mental illness?
Well, I used the few conversations I had with him, but, I just tried to, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of, crazy people don't speak like they do in a lot of movies. They're just really ramped up people often and go from idea to idea and, really believe what's happening to them. So I just tried to have him narrating as if everything that was happening to him was happening to everyone around him too.
Just write it in first person.
Yeah, all the characters. But I don't think I'm gonna finish it. Someday.
More talking back, please. Do you think different? Oh, you have a question? Yay.
Sue, I'd just like to say, it would have been awesome to see some more anecdotes from before you met the guy.
From my life
From-
before.
Or maybe because you're showing this change, and I feel like you could have put, or it would have been fun for me to hear about or to see other anecdotes before.
No, that's good. This is
More wallflower.
yeah. For the time submission, it's a very strict length, but because I'll probably rewrite it and send it elsewhere, I can play a lot more. So thank you. I will do that. Show me being a loser more. Okay.
I guess that's another question for everybody, right? Is like, what do you kind of already know you want to change, even if you don't know what you're going to change it to?
Robert?
The expert on revision.
I'm mulling over that question. Can you say any names?
What about the piece that you read, do you kind of already know you want to change, even if you don't know quite yet what you want to change it to?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of vagueness in mine. So, and when I was, writing it under pressure, I could feel it. I could feel that vagueness. Oh gosh, this is not going to go down well. But actually, it's great because I've got points in the essay that I really need to develop, unpacking certain theories of revision and so on, and connecting more with personal stories. And I remember I wrote this down from Sue's talk, and she says, "What do we owe the people who awaken us?" It's just a great sentence. Goes to the heart of what I think I'm trying to say in a way as well.
I've been trying to write something and allow myself to digress a great deal, which I didn't for tonight, at least by my standards. You know, I have this desire to spin off and talk about John Boorman's Exorcist II, The Heretic, and because it's weird, not necessarily because it's relevant. There are a few other things that I wanted to spin off, and I've been questioning that. There's value, obviously, to directness and keeping things in control. One thing that does need to be developed further, and I didn't really for tonight because there wasn't enough time, but is Richard Marquand. You know, this poor guy had done a couple direct-to-TV movies, and then he did Return of the Jedi, and then he did Jagged Edge, which I guess was okay, and then he did Hearts of Fire, which is supposedly a terrible movie starring Bob Dylan, and then he dropped dead, and he was pretty young, and it's sort of a strange, and I want a coda for Richard Marquand. I think he deserves, and I'd like to bring his voice into it a little bit. So these are some of the things that I'm thinking of introducing to it.
Who do you hope your audience to be? Where do you want to publish it?
Yeah, I used to have a clearer sense of that when I started. I actually asked an editor if I could write a book about David Lynch's Lost Highway specifically, and he said yeah, and I wrote him a proposal, and then I didn't send it because I started having other ideas for other things I wanted to write about David Lynch and to expand. This Return of the Jedi thing is really a footnote, both in what I want to do with Lynch and in Lynch's career. So the answer is now, no, I don't know. I imagine a very, very peculiar book with a lot of personal stuff in it, you know, sort of memoir bits in it, which are the closest thing to that in this version is the story about my mother and father going out to the movies, but there's more. So I really don't know. I'm in a state of flux with it that I want to maintain and not worry too much about the end result. But, you know, if somebody wants to publish it.
Do you think you'll interview David Lynch in that process, or do you like having an academic distance from him?
I don't like having an academic distance from him. I'd love to talk to David Lynch, but I also feel that I can do a lot of work without speaking to David Lynch. I did consider like driving by his house, writing from that point. But I think there's an enormous amount of material about him, enormous amount of interviews, and I would really want to make sure that I had questions to ask that nobody else had asked before I approached anybody about that. But I would love to just sit in a room with that guy. Yeah, that would be great.
Why did you want to write about him?
I think that David Lynch and I have a lot in common. And I don't know how that sounds actually. Saying it out loud for the first time is strange. But when I watch his films, I recognize a lot of my own thinking. And they make sense to me in that way. And when I hear him talk, all of his idiosyncrasies, everything about him, just I feel it's very familiar. And so I also see it as a launching point for developing ideas of my own. You know, he's got his hands in so many different projects outside of film. You know, from carpentry to music and house building and all sorts of strange things, transcendental meditation, things that I'd be interested in talking about, thinking about. So, I guess that's it.
Do you have a question now that you would ask him that nobody else has asked him?
No, not yet. Not yet.
So you're still in the research?
Definitely, very, very, very definitely. I'm happily, deeply in the research phase. I don't think there's a single David Lynch book in the Brown Library right now. They're all in my office. And I've been really delving into it and keep finding new pathways.
I have a question for Ed real quick. So you have this character of like apology guy, right? And like right now we've heard two, and I guess you have a few more.
Yeah. There's about 3 more
written, and then there's like a stack of things you could apologize about.
So you have like the apology form, and then you
Yeah.
have like a list of apology-worthy
Potentially,
topics,
right,
yeah.
Right.
Are you at all worried that
I'm-
it's gonna wear, well, specifically about the thing that I'm about to say, which is, are you all worried that like, we're gonna be like, shut up, like, just stop doing
Wait,
things?
did that happen already?
Well, no, not yet, but, so, do you guys know the Donald Barthelme story of the school?
Yeah.
This is the story about this school where everything dies. Like everything just starts to go wrong. Like first the class plant dies, and then the class fish dies, and then like the hamster dies, and then they kind of work up to like, we weren't even supposed to have a puppy. And they just kind of like keep going with it, escalate it, and then like some kids die. And so like that's really funny. It's a super great story, and it's easy to find. But it's as long as a story is. And I don't think this is necessarily what's going to happen, but I wondered if you were like, is it going to break at any point?
That's what I don't know, right? Because
Okay.
I got this far into it. This is why this is really in progress here.
Right.
It's sort of set aside in that part. No, I got this far into it, and I realized that the problems were bigger than I was ready to handle at that point.
Yeah.
And I realized it's the kind of, I don't know, when I'm working on longer stuff like novels and things, even short stories, like, yeah, I have to be in the bubble because it's not linear. And like, I mean, figuring it out as I go along, it's not linear. And I realized that to actually do this, I would have to be in the bubble to figure out all these things, because it basically is all the problems of an epistolary novel, which is like, you get the glimpses, but you don't have the arc. And you have to figure out how much stuff to put around the edges that readers are going to just barely figure out. So yeah, no, I mean, the idea was this would be apologies, but some of them wouldn't really be apologies too. When Catherine asked him, the Charles Williams poem about this is just to say where the narrator eats the plums, and he's really sad about it, but he really liked the plums too. So the idea was that like there would be some apologies and word apologies, and some who would just say their apologies. They have nothing to do, nothing to apologize to. So then I realized that's gonna take a lot of work to figure out all the variations of it, and I wasn't sure how long it could be if it became a book thing. It's like, for me, like, there's always this magic goal that like maybe I'll just write the 142 page novel, but like it'll be really easy, which they never are. So there's a lot to still potentially figure out.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great answer.
Okay, final call for talking back. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. This was fun. Thank you, readers. This was great.